we were draining the wetlands and cutting down the forest and all of that, and other things, slowly the numbers started to decline. And back in the day, it wasn't illegal to shoot them, and a lot of the farmers and ranchers would shoot them. They thought they were preying on their livestock, and so the numbers started to decline. And a lot of the wildlife conservationists, even Audubon himself, had noted that he was seeing fewer eagles. And to the point, by the early 1900s or so, it was becoming apparent the numbers were going down. And really kind of the nail in the coffin at that point was when the pesticide DDT was introduced. And nobody understood at the time, they thought it was this miracle pesticide to treat mosquitoes, which carry a lot of human-borne diseases. And of course, we want to protect ourselves from mosquitoes and their diseases. But it had really horrible impacts on the environment, and especially birds. And birds of prey like bald eagles, it was affecting their egg-laying capabilities, or the viability of their eggs, I should say. They were laying the eggs, but the eggs weren't hatching properly. So anytime you have some sort of species that is not having any young or raising any young, that's always an issue. So the population began to decline. People started noticing they weren't seeing any young bald eagles, and juvenile bald eagles are completely different from adults. They are all brown, so you can easily distinguish them from adults. And people said, well, gosh, we're not seeing any youngsters anymore. What's going on? To the point that, by the mid-1900s, they were starting to realize there was an issue. And so at that point, the federal government stepped in, and the eagles were listed, with the federal list of threatened and endangered species, and it was illegal to shoot them then. You couldn't cut down their nest tree, and a number of other protections came in. But also at that same time, they banned DDT, as they began to realize the horrible impacts it was having on our environment and the ecosystem and so on. And so all of those steps taken together really made a huge impact for bald eagles. And as soon as we started taking those steps to protect them and remove the threats to them, the main threats, they started making a massive comeback. And in addition to the legal protections they had in banning DDT, a number of other conservation measures were taken, which were really fascinating. And in the terms of reintroducing eagles to areas where they had gone extinct in certain states where the population had completely disappeared, they would go and get eagles, adults or youngsters or even eggs from other states and bring them in and hatch the eggs and raise the young and release them with the hopes that those birds would stay and reestablish the population. And so they did that quite successfully in a number of states. And one of the methods they use a lot in this type of setup is a hack tower. And that picture there you see on the right is actually a hack tower. And it's basically large fake nests that are up on stilts in the trees where an eagle would usually nest. And the young are placed in there when they're very small, and they're fed by humans as they grow. And then eventually when the young get ready to fly, they'll open the door, and so the young can take off when they're ready, as they would in the wild. But they still continue to put out food in those towers for them, so the young can come back and get food as they're learning to hunt for themselves, so that they have enough food to survive. And then eventually, as they do in the wild, they will move on and head out. So hack towers are a great way to reintroduce any species of bird like that into an ecosystem. But some other really fun things that different groups did over in California, they had eagles nesting on these islands, these mountainous islands, and the eggs weren't hatching out there either. So what biologists did was go and climb the cliffs, sneak the eggs out of the nest, put fake eggs for the adults to sit on, and take the eggs to local zoos, where a lot of zookeepers and zoos in general have experience with artificial incubation and hatching chicks and hand raising them. And so they would hatch the eagles and make sure the eggs were safe from getting broken, because what was happening is either the eggs would be so brittle from the contamination with DDT that the eggs would shatter before they could hatch, or else they would be soft-shelled and the embryo wouldn't develop properly. So they made sure the eggs had the proper environment to hatch safely, and then as the chicks got a few days old, then the biologists would sneak them back up into the mountain and put them back in the nest for the parents to raise, because it's always best, when possible, to let bald eagles raise bald eagles. So all of these measures together were great ways to reintroduce the population and also try to give them a step up in the areas where they were declining and struggling, along with all the protections that were put in place. But one of the other things I like to talk about, as my office is at the Audubon Center for Birds of Prey, which, if you're not familiar with, is one of Audubon, Florida's nature centers. But it actually started over 40 years ago with the goal of being a place for rehabilitation and treatment of injured birds of prey. So We have a clinic there. We see about 700 birds of prey each year. All of the typical species, red-shouldered hawks, red tails, vultures, osprey, caracara. But we also get 70 to 80 bald eagles a year that come through. And so the goal was to try and get them healthy and get them released back into the wild. And so rehab facilities around the country that are committed to this work, I think they really do play a key role in helping these species that are struggling, because every bird that gets treated and released is really getting a second chance to contribute to the wild population, and that's what it's all about. So that's a big part of what we do, and in my role with EagleWatch, I work closely with the clinic as we get eagles in, especially when it's time to release them, and making sure that we have a safe place for release. Eagles are very territorial, especially during the nesting season, so if we get an adult eagle in at this time of year, we don't want to release it next to an active nest because it will just get beat up by that pair. They'll be really angry about it, and so we try to find a safe spot for release. And then sometimes when we get really young eagles in during the spring season when they're hatching and trying to fledge, we have different methods we can use to get them back into the wild. And if they're small enough, one of the cool things we can do is actually re-nest them, either in the nest they came from or another nest. And these photos here are one of the first little eaglets that came through our clinic in the spring, and it came from Anclote Key, actually. And there was a nest on the key that had 2 chicks, and during one of those severe storms we had this spring, the nest blew down. And the park ranger there is part of the EagleWatch program, and we had heard that the nest had blown down. He went out to check and saw that unfortunately one of the chicks had perished, but one of them was still alive. And so we worked with the Raptor Center of Tampa Bay to arrange for the rescue. He brought the surviving eaglet back to the land by boat and met the Raptor Center folks there, and then they transported it over to us at the Center for Birds of Prey. And it's a cute little nugget. As you can see, it was about 5 to 6 weeks old when it came to us, and they usually start flying at around 10 to 14 weeks. So we thought, other than a few scrapes, he was actually in really good health, and so that was good news, no broken bones. And at that age, we decided, if possible, it would be best to put him in another nest. He couldn't go back to his own nest, of course, because that nest had blown down. So we used our EagleWatch data, and I would look at the nest map and see which nest over in that area had young of a similar age that were in an area that we could actually get to, that we could get permission to access the nest. And we do also have to get permission from U.S. Fish and Wildlife anytime we go up to a nest and do anything that interacts with the nest. So we got their permission, and we found a nest in Tarpon Springs that's on church property, and the church was very gracious and let us come out and climb the tree. And so we have one of our excellent tree climbers, Jim Lott, who is trained to handle raptors, and we put the little baby in a duffel bag, and Jim roped it up the tree and put it back in the nest with its little foster sibling. And the good news is that eagles will raise young that are not their own. I always joke that they either can't count or they don't care. So they will raise babies that we put in the nest that are not theirs. So that's the good thing, and we use that to our advantage in these rehoming situations. So here's the video Jim took of the little eaglet up in the nest there with his new foster sibling. And the foster sibling's like, "Who this? Gonna eat all my fish, now I have to share my food, darn." But it was a really windy day, and it was incredibly high up, and so Jim did an excellent job getting that baby back in the nest. But our volunteers were great in keeping an eye on the nest there, and they documented our little foster baby growing up with its sibling and its family. And then there you see on the right when it took its flight and was flying around the area and had fledged successfully. That was a great moment to see it doing so well. And we do band all of the eagles before we release them, and so you'll see that it has some bling on its legs, and that helps us track them and see how they're doing over time. And we'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. But so I really do give a shout out to all the rehabbers out there doing the hard work. It's, sometimes thankless and tiring, and a lot of them that come to us can't be saved, but we do our best to get as many as we can out. And it's always wonderful to see a bald eagle take to the skies again and know that it's going to hopefully go out there and make future bald eagle babies down the road when it gets to maturity. But when you look at the history of the population from the point that they were really, at their lowest and then recovering, in the early 60s or so, they were down to less than 500 breeding pairs across all of the U.S. And that was really quite a low for them. And with all the protections and the conservation methods and rehab facilities, etc., over the next decades, they made a massive comeback to the point that they were actually delisted. So they're no longer on that list of threatened and endangered species as of 2007. And then looking at Florida's numbers specifically, we were down to less than 80 breeding pairs at the point that they were listed. And then by 2007, we were up to about 1,200 breeding pairs per the estimate of Florida Fish and Wildlife. And we do have one of the largest breeding populations of bald eagles here in Florida outside of Alaska. So that's another cool fact I learned when I came to this job. I never really thought about how fortunate we are in Florida to have so many bald eagles that live here and nest here. Other than like Minnesota, Wisconsin, we're one of those leaders in the lower 48 states as far as breeding population. So, looking how are they doing in the last, decade or so, they've been doing really well, in our state and also around the country. Florida Fish and Wildlife's last estimate was in 2017, and they at that time thought it was around 1,600 breeding pairs. And then U.S. Fish and Wildlife did their own surveys and estimates this spring, and there's a whole document you can read if you're interested in those kind of statistics to hear about how they did some aerial surveys over parts of the country, and then they also took eBird data and did some statistical modeling to determine what they think the population size actually is. And it was quite fascinating to see that the population was a lot larger than they originally had estimated probably 3 or 4 years ago. So they put the total population of breeding pairs in the U.S. at about 72,000. So that's quite an increase, and that's great news. We're happy to hear they're doing well. That doesn't mean that they don't still have threats and things to be concerned about, and that's really where EagleWatch comes in. But as you're looking at, bald eagles in general, I thought I'd kind of transition and just give some of the basics about them as we talk about their biology, but as we also talk about their breeding behavior. EagleWatch is really focused on the nesting behavior and watching the nests and so on. But eagles are super fun to watch nest for a number of reasons, and it's interesting because they are one of those pairs or types of species that are considered monogamous in the sense that they will come back to each other, the same pair, year after year, as long as they are each alive. Usually, it's pretty rare for them to replace a mate if that mate is still available. And if they lose one of their mates, they will usually, they'll take another one, of course, but they do come back to each other year after year. They come back to the same nest territory year after year, so it's pretty easy to know where to look for them. And people that are involved in the program over any length of time, these eagles really become like family as you watch them come back each year and raise their young. It's really heartwarming to get to see and experience that with them each season. And as is true of all raptors, the females in raptors are larger than the males. So if you ever see owls or vultures or eagles next to each other, if there's a pair of them and one of them is larger, it's probably the female. And so females actually rule the roost in the bald eagle world, and they have a lot to say about restoring the nest each fall when they come back and they meet up with their mate again. They do nestorations where they're taking fresh sticks in and kind of getting the nest ready for the next season. And as I said, they do use that same nest year after year. And the nest can be quite large, so it's quite fascinating to watch them work on it. But she does have a very strong opinion about which sticks are suitable and where the sticks should go. So the videos of them fighting over the sticks always makes me giggle. And he'll bring a stick in and she doesn't like it, and she throws it over the edge, or he puts it in one place and she waits till he leaves and she moves it somewhere else. But they are a great pair. They do work closely together throughout the nesting season. They both take turns incubating the eggs. They both take turns feeding the young and bringing food back. So having a good mate that you can rely on is incredibly valuable. It takes a lot of energy and time to raise bald eagle babies. So that probably is one of the drivers in the fact that they do tend to practice monogamy more so than other species, because if you can find a mate that can help you raise those babies and be successful and defend your territory, that's incredibly valuable. So when you look at their nest, it is one of the largest bird nests out there. It can be the size of a small mattress or a small car or a mattress in a tree, 10 to 12 feet wide, 12 to 14 feet deep. Sometimes they just keep stacking on top of each other. We get like these double and triple deckers. The largest nest ever was over in St. Petersburg, Florida, and it weighed 2 tons when it collapsed. So I guess they gathered all the material on the ground and weighed it. So they do weigh quite a bit. As I said, they add to it each year. And they will nest in, dead trees, live trees. Their preferred nesting substrate is generally those tall, old pines that are, sturdy enough and thick enough with the trunk to have the branches to support a nest of that size, as you can imagine. But they'll nest in Australian pines and cypress trees, occasionally maybe an oak tree, but not as regularly as we see with the other types. And then they also nest on man-made structures here in Florida, which is quite fascinating. And sometimes they do have a couple of nests in their territory. So if you've been watching them nest at one location for several years and then they show up and they start courting and then they disappear, they probably have another nest somewhere in the area that they're using. And sometimes they take a year off, so everyone needs a break now and then. So I always encourage my volunteers not to give up if they see the pair come back and then the pair doesn't nest. Either they've got another nest somewhere we don't know about, or they're just taking a year off, but they generally will come back to that nest at some point. But if you look at across the continent outside of Florida, they have some really interesting nesting behaviors. Something really fascinating that was reported a year or so ago on the barrier islands off the coast of Virginia was eagles nesting on the ground. And that's not something you see very often. And I'm guessing on the barrier islands there must not be any suitable trees to build a nest in, or very few of them, and also no ground predators to worry about. And they nested successfully in that nest on the ground. So that's always fascinating. And then of course as you head out west, the eagles will be nesting on cliffs in the rocky areas with their giant nests. And even down in like Arizona, they documented eagles nesting in those giant cacti, which seems like it could be dangerous with all the prickly parts. But I think what I really love when I watch all the different ways they nest is just their adaptability and their ability to just make it work. They find different ways to get it done and to raise their families and to nest where they can. And even as I said, here in Florida, they do tend to nest a lot on artificial structures, which we'll talk a bit more about in a minute in depth. But as far as even beyond what structures they nest on, you see some interesting things as well. These aren't the norm, but we are seeing some really funny behaviors with nesting in other areas. Up in I think it's in the Midwest, there's a trio of eagles that nest. And as I said before, they're actually generally very territorial. So when you have a pair of eagles, they generally don't tolerate any other adults in the area, and they will fight to the death. They're very serious about defending their territory. So it's highly unusual with this situation. It ends up being 2 males and a female, and every year they come back together and nest and work together to raise the young. But that is highly unusual. We're not, there's a lot of theories about how that came to be and why they're tolerating that, but they're making it work. So I'm sure those babies have all the food they could possibly need at that point. And then in the other picture you see there is a situation, a few times we've had documented that bald eagles have raised other species. And this was a picture of a red-tailed hawk that bald eagles raised by accident, I guess you would say. Again, different theories on how it happened. The leading thought is perhaps the adult eagle stole a red-tailed hawk chick out of a nest and was bringing it back to feed its babies, and then the chick didn't die, and then it started begging at some point, and the urge to put food in a begging mouth for a bird is really strong, and so they just started feeding it, and then it grew up and they fledged a red-tailed hawk along with their baby bald eagles. So kind of a cute story that is funny about how they raised something that wasn't their own. So again, really fascinating birds. One of my favorite things about birds is they're always doing something interesting, and you can never say always or never with birds. They'll always prove you wrong and do something strange. Here in Florida, our nesting season actually runs from October to May, and we're a little bit earlier than the rest of, as you head north in the U.S., eagles up north nest later. Obviously, here in Florida, they're nesting over the winter, which is a beautiful time to nest. It's our dry season, so that means the water levels are lowering. It's easier for them to catch fish in that shallower water. All the waterfowl come back to Florida for the winter, so there's lots of coots and other things for them to catch to feed their babies. And it's a beautiful time to be outside. It's not too hot, not too cold. But of course, if you're up north in the winter, it's really cold up there. So they tend to wait to nest up north towards the spring, and they'll nest through the summer. And our eagles are also a little smaller than the eagles up north, which is interesting as well. And that's kind of a biological mechanism that's related to retaining heat. So as you get larger in body size, you retain heat better. And so as you're heading north where eagles have to deal with colder temperatures, they are actually larger than our eagles. So if you've been to Alaska especially, you'll notice the size difference for sure. But here in Florida, they do start nesting in October, but we have a range. So we have our early bird nesters who lay eggs in November and hatch their chicks in December. But then you have some of our eagles that don't lay their eggs till January, February. We've had eggs laid as late as April, and those young have fledged in June and July. But that's not the usual, average. So the average is usually most of the chicks hatch in January to February and they fledge, March to April. But there is some staggering of the different pairs and what they do. So right about now, what we're seeing mostly with our eagles is they're coming back and working on their nest together and starting to get ready to lay eggs. I think I actually saw one of my volunteers noted incubation, which is really one of our earliest pairs going down on eggs right now. And incubation is about 32 to 35 days, and they can lay up to 4 eggs. And the female or the male, they start incubating those eggs with the very first egg, and they lay them every other day. So this causes kind of a difference in size and age as the eggs are hatching. So the first egg that was laid will be a day and a half older and larger than the second egg, and so on. And this can become an issue down the road with differences in size and out competition in the nest if they're feeding the babies and the smallest chick is so small and can't fend for itself and get enough food. So sometimes they don't all make it. But in Florida, we're lucky to have a good food source, and a number of our nests do fledge 3 young, but 2 is generally the average. So they hatch. Those eggs have to be sat on at all times when they're in the nest. They do have to be kept at a very constant temperature to develop properly. So once they lay those eggs, you'll notice the behavior change because there will always be an adult in the nest sitting on those eggs, having to keep them warm and shelter them from the elements. And they will take turns, as I mentioned, sitting on those eggs. And then once they start hatching, you start seeing more activity as they're taking turns bringing food back. But the first couple weeks of life, those young chicks that hatch, they can't regulate their own body temperature. So the adults, again, somebody always has to be on the nest, kind of sheltering them, keeping them warm until they're old enough to regulate their own body temperature. And then as they grow, the adults spend less and less time at the nest, and they'll just drop food off at some point, and the young birds learn to tear it themselves. And the eagles are usually in the area, keeping an eye on the nest, making sure their babies are okay. But you'll see the adults around less and less until they're ready to fledge. So some of the things you'll see as they continue to grow is, they get ready to start to fly. You'll see wing flapping. They get out on the branches around the nest and they're hopping up and down. And this is usually the time that we get them in the clinic in the spring because they are hopping up and down and the wind starts blowing and they blow out of the nest, but they can't fly well enough to get back up. So it can always be, that's the season, part of the season that always gives me white hair as you're watching all of the young getting ready to fly and hoping they stay in the nest until they're ready instead of jumping out too early. And so as you look at how they grow, they are an incredibly fast growing bird. They start off so tiny. At that hatching, they're going to be kind of gray and fuzzy. And if you watch any of the bald eagle nest cams, you can see what they look like at that stage. Generally, from the ground, as an eagle watcher, you're not going to see this phase because the nest is high and it's really deep. But as they get to about 3 to 4 weeks, you might start seeing the little bobblehead above the rim of the nest, and they get this really cute little white mohawk that is super fuzzy and goofy looking. And then as they continue to grow, their feathers start coming in. They shed the white mohawk. They've got the long, the brown pin feathers growing in. Look like a pin cushion for a while, really awkward. And then eventually the feathers unfurl and they turn into this beautiful brown bird that's ready to fledge. And it does take them about 10 to 14 weeks to go from hatching to being ready to fly. So when they take their first flight, this is what they look like. And so as you can see, they look completely different from the adults. And we get calls occasionally from people saying they saw a golden eagle in Florida, and we don't actually have golden eagles here. Of course, occasionally any bird could show up somewhere it shouldn't be, but generally if what they've described as a brown bird the size of an eagle, it's probably a juvenile. So they've got a brown beak, they've got brown eyes, all brown feathers, and then their feet are still yellow. So that's the one giveaway. If you can see their legs and feet are bright yellow just like the adults are. But as with all birds, they do molt their feathers, so every year they shed their feathers. And as they're, going through each year's molting cycle, they grow in new feathers and their appearance changes. And their beak grows continuously like your hair and fingernails. So as the beak is growing, it's gradually changing colors from brown to yellow. And then their eye also starts to lighten to the lighter color that you see with an adult. So this is kind of the awkward teenage phase at 2.5 to 3 years. At that point, they still look a little goofy. But then finally, after about 5 years, it takes about 5 years, 5 successive molts for them to get that full adult plumage with the beautiful white tail and white head that we know and love. And that's usually the point when they are ready to breed and they're considered sexually mature at that point. So it's a good 5 years or so, a good 5-year journey for them. And, of course, with most species, mortality and survivability is The greatest risk is that first year of life, but if they make it past that first year, they generally have a good 80% chance or so of continuing to survive. In the wild, I think the oldest bald eagle that was documented was 37, and they know that because it was banded as a chick in a nest as part of a research study, and then 37 years later, unfortunately, was struck by a car. And when they recovered the body, they found the leg band and traced it back through the banding lab and discovered it had been banded 37 years ago as a baby. So, and of course, in captivity with regular medical care, they don't have to be worried about getting hit by a car. Some of the eagles in zoos have lived up to 50 years. So a very long-lived species, given the right circumstances, and nesting for a long time too. A lot of the nests we've monitored, have been active for decades. So super cool again to watch what they do. Now, as those babies are leaving the nest for the first time, even when they first start flying, they do stick around for a week or two. Their parents will supplementally feed them as they're teaching them the ropes. They're not necessarily self-sufficient right away, and they do depend on their parents for a little bit of time as they're learning how to hunt for themselves and catch their own food. But once they have got the hang of it and they're ready to go, that first summer and each summer after that, the juveniles generally migrate based on tracking studies and banding studies. They will migrate up the Atlantic flyway, and one bird that we know about in particular, some of them go as far as Canada, hang around out there over the summer, and then they come back to Florida in the fall, and they roam around the state in the fall and the winter and the spring, and then when summer comes again the next year, they take off on their migration again. And they'll do that, for the 5 or so years as they're maturing, and then eventually once they settle down with their own breeding territory, the general consensus is that at that point they may leave their breeding area for a bit over the summer to go somewhere else and fatten up and take a break, but they don't usually go too far because you want to make sure you protect your territory and that you can come back and use it again the next year. So the migration part is really fascinating, and some of the birds we've banded as well, we've gotten those reports back from them being seen out of state, which is always fun, that they're up in Ohio or wherever they might be over the summer. And so, of course, they come back to Florida, and the pressures here are ongoing. We have one of the highest rates of development in all of the states. There's always people moving to Florida, new roads being built, areas being bulldozed for, homes and shopping centers. And so, loss of habitat's a big concern, those pressures that come with that. This photo here was an area that used to be nothing but heavy woods down by the Orlando airport, and slowly over the last 5 years, most of that area has been bulldozed, and there's industrial area there now and lots of buildings and so on. And you can see the nest in that photo. They bulldoze pretty much right up to the tree. And thankfully the eagles keep coming back there. They've tolerated all the changes in their environment, but so that's always a concern, something we definitely keep an eye on as we're watching nests. And also pine bark beetle disease is an issue in the state. If you've noticed pine trees dying, pine bark beetles do kill off the pine trees, and so some of the nests that our pairs nest in have been slowly dying, and they'll nest in that dead tree for a while until it's no longer stable or suitable. But it is, of course, both of those pressures, loss of habitat from development and loss of habitat from that disease, are a concern for our birds. And then environmental toxins, anytime you have a lot of people, you've got issues with rodenticide use in the urban areas where eagles are nesting. You get, still lead toxicity is an issue with eagles foraging on carcasses. They do eat roadkill, and they'll eat even deceased animals that have been shot by hunters, and they can get that secondary toxicity from lead bullets if they've been in the animal that they're eating on. And then, of course, electrocutions, car strikes. For these eagles that are in areas where there's a lot of roads and electrical lines, these are all common things we see with the birds that come through our clinic, that they get struck by a car or they get electrocuted flying along. And then climate change, of course, that's the great unknown. How will that impact the bald eagle population? Anecdotally, just looking at historic maps, there used to be more eagles nesting in South Florida than we really see nesting there now, and so that could support the general idea that breeding ranges are shifting northward. Maybe the season will change a little bit. Are they changing the time they nest, which can be an issue then as it relates to when is the food available for them to feed their young. So these are all things to think about. And sea level rise, eagles that nest on the coast, how will that impact them if sea level rise impacts their nest tree and they have to move inland and so on? Everyone gets squished into a smaller space. Talking about habitat loss, in addition to losing habitat, the other side of that is eagles getting squished into smaller spaces. And so one of the things we see now in Florida that's kind of interesting is eagles are nesting closer together than they used to. And back in the day, the general thought was that eagles had to have at least a mile around their nest territory, and they wouldn't tolerate other eagles nesting anywhere within that mile. But now we have eagles nesting a quarter of a mile, 3/10 of a mile, up to half a mile from each other. And they're learning to live together, which is great, and tolerate each other, but territory fights are still an issue. And you can see the picture there of a bird that came into us from a territory fight, unfortunately. And she, at that point, was not releasable to the wild, so they can be incredibly severe injuries, and some of them don't survive the fight, unfortunately. And then they also have to fight with other species. Florida's home to a thriving osprey population, and osprey like to nest in some of the same types of structures that eagles do. And so we have these scuffles every year. Sometimes osprey will try to take over an eagle nest, or eagles will try to take over the osprey nest. And even great horned owls, even though they're a little bit smaller, they are incredibly tenacious, and their grip strength is stronger than a bald eagle, and they will legitimately drive eagles off a nest and take it over. And we have about 12 to 15 nests each year that we monitor that get taken over by great horned owls. Usually when that happens, the eagles will just move somewhere nearby and rebuild a nest for themselves to use, but that is always something we document to see how it's going. And but great horned owls don't like to build their own nests, so I've seen cases like a nest blew down in a hurricane, and the eagles worked so hard to rebuild the nest, and then the owls were like, thanks very much, and moved in and took it over. And then the eagles just had to go build another one. So it's always interesting when I see those photos come back from volunteers. You can see the little tufts blowing in the wind, and the owls have taken it over. But I know they need to nest somewhere too, but it is one of the issues we have to deal with here. Talking about toxins in the environment, one of them I didn't really touch on a second ago is barbiturates. And so it's interesting with, this is usually something we see at landfills. So any of the animals that get euthanized at like a vet clinic or something like that, they've been euthanized with that euthanasia solution, and then when they get disposed of possibly at a landfill, they're supposed to be buried to a certain depth. But sometimes that doesn't happen, or something may uncover those bodies, and then eagles feed on dead animals, and if they feed on animals that have been euthanized, they get that secondary toxicity from the euthanasia. And we get a couple of eagles each year that come to us in a coma from having fed on an animal like that at the landfill. And this bird here was one of those. They brought her up from Brevard and thought she had died in the trip, and then thankfully they recovered fairly quickly with just some general flushing the toxins out of their system and general supportive care. And within a week, she was ready to go back again, and we were able to release her back into the wild. But these are all things that we track closely, and if we see repeat offenders like landfills where it's constantly an issue, the Department of Environmental Protection gets involved and can go speak to them and see what's going on out here and how can we make this better. But yeah, landfills are a great place to see eagles if you've never gone to one for a tour. It's quite fascinating to see how many, especially the younger birds, lots of good food out there and rats and things to eat on. Some of the other things besides car strikes that I talked about, some of the plastic debris in the environment and fishing line. Those are the other two issues we see a lot with our nests. And sometimes, I was talking to a fisherman once, and he was like, we always get a bad rap, for cutting the line. He goes, but sometimes we have to cut the line. You start to reel something in, and you realize whatever you've caught is you can't legally catch because of the regulations for size and what type of fish it is. And they cut the line, but the lure stays in the fish, and then if the eagle catches that fish and takes it back to the nest, we've had cases where the young have gotten stuck in the hook. In this case, this was a young eagle in a nest in Osceola County, and the parents brought a fish back, and at this stage the young was learning to tear the fish itself, and it was tearing and got its foot stuck in one end of the hook, and then it got its beak stuck in the other end, so it was basically hogtied and couldn't get itself loose. And thankfully this was a nest that our EagleWatch volunteers watch. It was in their backyard, and they noticed the eagle was acting weird because it wasn't raising its head and it wasn't really moving as much as it had been. And finally they got a good look through binoculars and realized that there was a fish hook in it. So we worked with U.S. Fish and Wildlife to get permission to go up in the nest, and we got a high reach and went up and got the bird out and were able to take the hook out and then release it back into the wild a few weeks later. So these are some of the issues we deal with, just the garbage that's in the environment, like the plastic here. Eagles took that plastic back up into the nest when they were taking something to line the nest, and then the chick got stuck in it and ended up perishing. So these are all things just to highlight, different ways we can think about what we're introducing into the environment and ways that we can change maybe some of our own behaviors to make sure that those detriments aren't out there and they don't have to worry about them. But this is really kind of where EagleWatch comes into play. EagleWatch started in 1992, so it's actually been around for a while. And in 1992, at that time, eagles were still under, threat of disappearing. And so, people that were concerned about eagles in Florida and wanted to make sure that our population would continue to do well and persist for their grandchildren and grandchildren's grandchildren got together and said, how can we help make sure that eagles are safe here, that they have a good place to raise their family? And so it was a handful of volunteers, like 20 volunteers in 3 Central Florida counties, started watching nests and collecting data and sharing it with U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and monitoring for disturbances as development was going in. And so all of that, was kind of the beginnings of EagleWatch. And this last season, 2021, we were active in 50 counties. We had about 550 volunteers monitoring just over 1,000 nests. So the program's really grown. You can see here a quick visual of our coverage of the state. We tend to be active in urban areas because that's where people live and that's where our volunteers live. There will always be some counties that are very rural and undeveloped that we won't necessarily be able to monitor, and we're pretty much limited to monitoring nests that we can view from a public area or with property owner permission. So you'll see that does kind of determine some of the areas that we're mostly active in. Just looking at your area, I tried to kind of look at Tampa Audubon's overall footprint, and from your website and some of the areas that it said that you all cover, I kind of tried to do a little snapshot of the nests in that area that we monitor. So if you look at all of the nests that have ever been documented, historically there are 61 nests in that general area of the Tampa Audubon coverage area. And we monitored 42 of those nests last year. So, and some of those 61 nests may actually be nests that no longer exist. They're just still on the map for historic reasons. But we monitored 42 of them, and half of those were occupied by eagles. And then 19 of those 21 were actually successful and fledged young. So they had a good year in that area. And what's interesting about your part of the state is that a good portion of your nests are actually on artificial structures, and I'd say the majority of the nests in the Tampa area are actually on artificial structures as compared to tree nests. So that's an interesting thing about Hillsborough, and Pinellas, Polk County is another one that has a very high percentage of nests on artificial structures. But we'll talk about that more. What does that look like and what does that mean for eagles? But what EagleWatch does in general, first of all, is just documenting where the nests are. Each year we find or hear about, 100 or more new nests that have never been documented. And so we assign a nest ID and add them to the map, and that's really the best way to protect them. As developers are looking at areas that are, woods right now, they want to know what's out there that might impact what I can build, and definitely having a bald eagle nest on that property will impact some of what you can do with that. So, they often use our tools of maps to see where the eagles are nesting, and so documenting where they are is the first step to protecting them. And of course, also collecting that data. We track to see, is the nest active this year? If it was active, how many chicks hatched? And if it hatched chicks, how many survived to fledge? And that's really the key data, how many survive to fledge, because if you hatch 1,000 chicks but 0 survive to fledge, then your population basically ends the season with 0 growth. You haven't added anything to the population. So you always want to look at how many birds are being added through fledging each year. And then we also look at those threats and disturbances. The eagle watchers are usually the first to notice when land that the nest is on goes up for sale, or when they have signs that show up like new community coming here, or we're going to develop here, and those types of things. So we work closely with developers and other entities to make sure they're aware of the nest, and working with the proper authorities to make sure the nests are protected. Because even though the eagles are no longer on that list of threatened or endangered species, they are still protected by federal laws, federal and state laws. And the main law that protects bald eagles at the federal level is the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act. And that's the one that makes it illegal still. You can't cut down their nest tree at any time of year without a federal permit, even if it's not actively being used. You can't poison, shoot, harm in any way bald eagles. And the one that we see most with our program as we're monitoring nests is it's illegal to disturb the nest during the nesting season. And the hard part about that is really disturbing is something that the eagles have to define. So I may be disturbed by the work that somebody's doing too close to a nest, but if the eagles are tolerating the work and don't seem to care, that's really the main thing that the authorities look at. So Florida Fish and Wildlife is the law enforcement for these laws that protect eagles, and we'll have them come out to watch what's going on and see what the eagles are doing. But we just have to be able to document that the eagles are disturbed by the work. And if the eagles are disturbed by the work and the nest fails because of the work, and those folks did not have a permit for their work, that is a federal violation, which is very severe penalties as far as large fines and even possible jail time. So to avoid disturbing the eagles, U.S. Fish and Wildlife came out with some suggested buffers. So these aren't laws, but they are guidelines and suggestions. And they've said basically if you're going to do work near an eagle nest during the breeding season, as long as you stay outside of 330 feet for most types of work, you're probably not going to disturb them. If you have to do work near the nest within 330 feet during the nesting season, they strongly suggest that you get a federal permit for disturbance, which will help protect you if what you do causes the nest to fail. But you're not required to get a permit. You could work 100 feet from a nest all you want, and if the eagles don't care, then it's legal. So that's the one thing we have to remind ourselves of as we're watching what's going on out there. So each year we do document a decent amount of disturbances. 100 plus of the nests we monitor each year have some sort of construction going on or recreational activities and so on that are an issue. So it's stressful and hard to watch, but I think again, what I've seen again and again is the majority of the eagles do seem to do okay and tolerate the work. And we do try to help everyone make sure that they're doing the right thing and have the permits they need and they're following the guidelines and so on. So beyond that, educating the community. Like I said, sometimes people are starting to develop and have no idea about the nest. They don't understand the regulations. They don't realize the restrictions. And they're, people legitimately want to do the right thing most of the time, and especially in areas where eagles are nesting in neighborhoods, making sure people are aware of the nest and talking with them and winning fans for eagles. Some people that have eagle nests on their property aren't super thrilled about eagles because it can be restrictive as far as what they can do or if they want to try and sell the land. So I'm always trying to educate people about how cool eagles are and ways that we can protect them. And then occasionally our volunteers get involved in helping downed eagles or young eaglets that blow out of the nest, because typically they're the first ones to notice if something's wrong. They've been watching a nest that had 2 chicks and suddenly they go back and only one of them's up there and it's too early for them to be flying. They might notice that there's one on the ground below the nest. Maybe it fell out of the nest or something happened. We don't expect our volunteers to rescue the eagles. They are incredibly dangerous even as young. They have those incredibly strong talons. But we do work with a number of organizations to rescue them and get them transported for help. A good portion of the eagles that come through our clinic each year are eagles that came from nests that we monitor. So I'm always grateful for their eagle eyes, as it were, out there watching the nest and making sure they're safe. Some of the other issues we deal with, we get eagles are picking up sticks and taking them back to the nest to line their nest at the start of the season, and sometimes there's debris that's attached to the sticks. And there was a nest down on Marco Island that had a giant cast net stuck up on the edge, and it was like the very end of September. The nesting season was just getting ready to start. The pair was back, but they hadn't really gotten serious yet, and the volunteer noticed the net up there, and so quickly mobilized, getting permission from U.S. Fish and Wildlife to go up and get the net off the nest, then trying to find someone that had a high reach that was willing to do it, and get it done quickly so that we could get it off the nest before they started laying eggs, just to make sure that as the young hatched, they wouldn't have to worry about getting stuck in that mess. And so Rosemary was a great champion for that nest. She found a tree company that donated their time and used their high reach to go up and take the net off. So that nest had, didn't have to worry about that net last year. So that was a great success story there. And then we also work with some of these companies that own the cell towers and other structures that eagles are nesting on. We had a nest in Tampa actually last year that had a subadult eagle. So you can see this bird's probably like 3 to 4 years old, that visited a tower where there was a nest and somehow got its wing stuck in the metal bars of the tower. We're not quite sure how it managed to do that, but a business next to the tower who knew the EagleWatch volunteer because they communicated and had good relations, called the EagleWatch volunteer and said, there's an eagle up there stuck and it's flopping around. And then the EagleWatch volunteer called the cell tower company, and they quickly sent a crew up the tower to get the bird down. And thankfully it was able to be rehabilitated and released later on. So we try to have good relationships with all the people around where we monitor nests and the companies that own these structures they're nesting on. But talking about these nests on artificial structures, getting back to that topic, of all the nests that we monitor, about 20% are now on man-made structures like cell towers and power line transmission towers and osprey platforms or stadium lights. I'm trying to think what else they've nested on. It's pretty much the usual. This is probably higher than the statewide average because we do tend to be focused in urban areas where there are more of these structures. Statewide, I think the average is probably closer to 7 or 8% of our eagles nest on man-made structures, but for EagleWatch and our monitoring, it's at 20%. So of course we want to know how these eagles are doing. Like if they're nesting on the cell tower, are they as successful as the eagles nesting in trees? And the good news is our data shows that they are. So each year when I look at the data from each season and how many young fledged and how successful the nests were, I compare artificial structure nests with tree nests. And as you can see, the nests on artificial structures have been as successful and sometimes more successful than nests in trees. There can be a variety of factors driving that. I think, we do have a lot of storm events in Florida, and trees are more susceptible to falling in a hurricane and so on. And also the extra height of a tower does give some sort of natural buffer from all the stuff that's going on down below it. So in those ways, I think towers can have an advantage. Of course, there are other effects we might not know about that we're not aware of at this point. What is all that radiation doing to the birds? But as far as we can tell, they're doing well on the towers, which is great. But we want to know what's the future going to look like down the road if eagles are nesting on these towers and if that trend is growing in Florida. And really in Florida, we're about the only state that's seen it at this magnitude so far. As we've talked to other states and biologists, nobody else has really seen it at the level that we are. So we kind of want to get on the forefront of predicting what this might mean for the population down the road. And one of the ways we decided to look at that was through an auxiliary banding study. And so asking the question, does the type of nest that a chick hatches in influence the type of nest it chooses when it becomes an adult and starts raising its own family? So if a chick hatches in a cell tower, will it be drawn to nest on a cell tower, and so on? And the way we're doing that is as young eagles come through the clinic for treatment, so we don't go up and nest and get birds out, but as they come through the clinic for treatment, as they get released, we give them a leg band that's colored based on the type of nest they came from. So as long as we know what type of nest they came from, we'll give them that color. So if they came from a natural nest, they get a green band. If they came from an artificial structure, they get a black band. And then we also DNA sex them to see if there's any correlation between what females do and what males do, etc. And so far we've been doing this since the 2017 nesting season, so 5 years now. We've banded and released 70 juvenile bald eagles with this auxiliary banding study. And what we love about these auxiliary bands is they're easy to read and easy to see. We do band all of our eagles with that silver federal band that you see on the other leg. And if you've ever seen a bird with a silver federal band, you know how incredibly challenging it can be to read the entire code. There are 9 digits stamped in that silver band, and it wraps all the way around the leg, and you do have to see all 9 digits to properly identify the bird. So just that silver band alone, it's really difficult to ID a bird. So the auxiliary band, though, is super easy to read, as you can see. And so we've already gotten a number of resites, some 14 or so more that have been seen over a month after the release, and some of them out of the state, which is always fun to hear. And what's interesting is that generally most of the birds that we do get in the clinic that have been released have come from natural nests. So there are more natural nest green bands out there than black. And for a while we had this trend where it was mostly females that were coming into the clinic and being released. But this last year we actually evened it out a bit. Last year we had about more males than females, which was interesting. So I always like to kind of look at that and think, well, I wonder what's driving that. Why are they coming more females or more males and so on? But looking at the resites, we've had them in Virginia, West Virginia, Ohio, Kentucky, as far as the out-of-state resites, and then a number of them that are within the state. Some of them that we see continually, we have one of our birds that was rescued in Manatee County in Bradenton in 2017, and her name is Eugene, but she's actually a girl, but she gets seen all the time. She's been seen like 7 times over the years, and she likes the landfill, and she likes all kinds of fun places, so I always love to see that she's out there doing well. She had a really rough start to life with a broken leg that had to have surgery and pins put in her leg, and so She always makes me smile to know that she made such a great recovery from a really rough start, and she's doing well out there. One of the birds this last year that we rescued was from a nest in the Orlando area, and the volunteer noticed that the chick was on the ground and she was a little too young to fly. So we got her rescued, brought her to the clinic, checked her out. She was healthy and ready to go in a few weeks and ready to fly, and we banded her. And then about a few weeks after she was released, she was seen up in Kentucky by some birders that were out at a nature preserve, and you can see the band there with her code on it, so we knew it was her. Again, always fun to see those birds. So just closing the presentation, moving forward as you're out there and about, what are some of the ways that you can help the eagles in Florida do well? This picture makes me giggle. We do have a number of eagles that nest in cemeteries. It's a nice, quiet place, I guess. And this bird here actually was from another state, but the picture made me laugh, so I had to put it in here. People had brought flowers to the graves and left them there, and this bird was curious and was goofing around and got the plastic pot stuck on his face, and he finally managed to get it off himself. But these are the types of things that, plastic debris and anything that's out there. It's just always think about keeping it clean as you're getting rid of garbage or what you're throwing away or what you're tossing out the window. Make sure that you're properly disposing of things that can be recycled and cutting down on your plastic use and so on. And then if you know about nests in your area, maybe take time to look and see it on our nest map. Is it a nest that we know about? There's oftentimes nests that get reported to us and people laugh and say, gosh, the nest has been in our neighborhood for 10 years, but we didn't really know anyone cared where it was. And so if you know about a nest, let me know. I'm happy to look to see if it's one we know about. If you see anything going on near a nest that you're worried about, you can always give us a call or contact Florida Fish and Wildlife to come out and check it out. And then thinking about toxins you're using. If you own a business or if you have rodenticide that you use around your house, think about finding other ways to take care of pests that might not have such a detrimental impact on the environment. Rodenticide is an issue for young chicks, especially as parents are bringing rats back to the nest, maybe that ate rodenticide. The young chicks are smaller body size and they're much more susceptible to those levels in the chick that the rat that they're consuming, and it reduces their ability of their blood to coagulate properly. And so if they end up getting a nick and start bleeding, they can actually bleed out, and we've had that happen with chicks in nests, unfortunately. And then eagle etiquette, that's the really basic way, especially if you're someone who watches nests or you're a wildlife photographer. Just making sure that you're watching from a distance and giving them the respectful quiet that they need to raise their young. Not playing eagle calls to try and get them to look at the camera or getting too close to get a great photo or whatever it might be. Just giving them the respect and the peace and quiet they need to raise their young and hopefully be successful in our state. So those are the ways I always talk about that we can help eagles in general. But of course, EagleWatch is there if you're interested. You're welcome to reach out if you're interested in learning more about the program. We do generally ask that you visit your nest twice a month during the nesting season. You do have to go through training first, of course, but after that, you go to your nest twice a month during the nesting season. You collect your data and you use either a web form or an app to submit your reports. And then that's basically it. It's pretty easy to do. It's a beautiful time to be outside. We have a great team of volunteers in your area, so I'm sure we could find a nest or two for you to monitor if you're interested. And that was a very quick whirlwind tour of EagleWatch and eagles in Florida. So here's my contact info. If you want to reach out to me about nest locations or getting involved with EagleWatch, feel free to email me. You can visit our website as well. I'd be happy to share any information you might need. And also, of course, now at this point, we're ready to answer your questions if you have any. I only see a few things in chat, so I guess maybe if anyone has questions, I don't know how you all usually do this. Do they ask them live, or would you prefer they use chat?
Well, Shawnlei, I have two questions that did come in on the chat. So I'll start with those, and then if other people either want to unmute or put them in the chat, and I can pass them on to you one by one. The first question that came in was, I do wonder if eagles might experience flight accidents or even get injured from them, especially when they're starting out.
And by flight accidents, do you mean like running into an airplane or just generally not knowing what they're doing and running into things? I do know we get issues with airstrikes, eagles that are in the area of airports for sure. But yeah, generally they can be really goofy when they're first learning to fly. I always say that my least favorite release to go on is a juvenile because they're so goofy and they don't really know what they're doing. And as soon as you try to point them the direction that's safest for them to go, they're determined to go back the other direction. And we had one eagle we released on a church property. It had this beautiful open field, and there was this one little shed over here. And doggone it, that bird took off and flew right into the building. I was like, you had that whole space. So, yeah, it's pretty crazy, how quickly they do develop their skills, but they can be a little goofy. And we have a tower nest in Orlando that's right in the middle of a very busy neighborhood, and the streets are very narrow, and we have issues there every year because once the young fledge, if they're not quite ready and they end up on the ground, the towers are so high, and when they're that young, it takes them more time. It's not like a large airplane. It needs a longer runway to get height to get up to the tower, and they just don't have the space to do it there. And so those are some of the issues we see in some of the urban areas. If they don't have enough space to get back up to the tower, especially, those can be issues. But yeah, they pick it up fairly quickly, I must say. We don't get a lot of eagles with issues from running into things. More than likely, it's eagles that got struck by something, like a car or something. So I hope that answered the question.
Okay, thank you. If not, he can put another question in the chat box or come on. Another question that came in: how do bald eagles or other birds of prey in general keep their head feathers so clean, since they aren't really bald the way vultures are?
Yeah, I think it's a good routine of bathing and using their feet to scratch and clean. And that fancy word, they rub their beak on the sticks. It's called feeking. So, and then if you've got a good mate, there's aloe preening where they preen each other. So, but they do a pretty good job, surprisingly, to not have hands to wash your face with. They do manage to stay fairly clean. Even the eagles that we have at the Center for Birds of Prey that are our permanent residents, they, between bathing and feeking and rubbing their face and using their feet to scratch, they keep it fairly clean. So kudos to them. They do look pretty good most of the time.
Okay, well, those are the two that came in. One, kudos to you. Thank you for a great presentation. So if anybody else has anything to add, questions, or if you just want to unmute yourself and ask at this point, go right ahead.
Great presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And I'll send it back to you since there's nothing else that I see coming in here. More thank yous, great information.
Y'all are sweet. Thank you very much.
Well, I think we all really enjoyed it. And thanks everybody for tuning in. And unfortunately, we are going to have to do our December meeting also by Zoom. But we're all hopeful that after that, we'll be able to meet in person again. And we'll let you know what the board thinks is the right thing to do. But I just think that we are so fortunate to share a planet with bald eagles and people like Shawnlei who help them persist on our planet. Thank you.
I'm just one person. It really all goes out to all the volunteers who dedicate their many hours to watch the nest and collect the data. So, I forgot to say earlier, but conservation is such a huge job, and it's not something that just one person like me can do. It really, community science is like the greatest idea ever that Audubon came up with years ago with the Christmas bird count. The data that you guys collect is so incredibly valuable, and it couldn't be done just by a few people. So all of you who do EagleWatch out there, I appreciate you. You're my heroes.
The eagles are great fun to watch.
Mm-hmm.
Two out of my 3 nests have at least had birds around them so far. So I'm looking for more this year.
Yeah, that's exciting. Thank you.
Well, thank you, everybody, and we'll see you next month, if not before.
That was very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It's a great program.
Thank
All
you.
right.
Take care.
Good night.
Enjoyed.
Good night, all.
Good night.
Thank
Thank
you.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night, Gracie.
Good night, George.